Not long after the pirates left, the lost boys decided to search for Peter Pan again. They began to spread out in all directions, but Nibs called them back together. "Hurry," he called. "I've seen a great bird. It's flying this way, and as it flies it calls, 'Poor Wendy!' It must be a Wendy bird." The boys were very excited. They'd never seen a Wendy bird. Tinker Bell flew down among the boys. She had a plan. "Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy bird," she said. The boys looked at each other. They never questioned their captain's orders. Toodles had a bow and arrow with him. He took out the arrow and placed it on the bow. He drew the string back, and then stopped. Tinker Bell could hardly wait. "Quick, Toodles, quick!" she screamed. "Peter will be so pleased." "Out of the way!" Toodles shouted. He fired. The arrow soared into the air and struck Wendy in her chest. Wendy fluttered and fell onto the hard ground. She lay very still. Tinker Bell flew over the boys. She laughed, then flew into the forest to hide. The boys crowded around Wendy. Soon they heard Peter calling to them. "Great news, boys!" he cried. "I have brought a mother for you. Her name is Wendy. Have you seen her? I believe she flew this way." The boys looked stricken. "Peter?" Toodles said slowly. "A terrible thing has happened and we are very sorry." They stood back. Peter saw Wendy lying on the ground. John and Michael began to cry. "Whose arrow?" Peter asked sternly. Toodles fell to his knees. "Mine, Peter," he said. Peter pulled the arrow out of Wendy's chest. He raised it above Toodles, holding it like a dagger. Toodles did not move. "Strike, Peter," he said. "I cannot strike," Peter said. "Something is holding my arm back." Suddenly Nibs cried out, "Look! It's Wendy! Wendy is alive!" Wendy smiled up at Peter. Peter bent down. Carefully, he lifted Wendy into his arms and carried her into his underground home. For the next several days, Peter, the lost boys, John, and Michael nursed Wendy back to health. Wendy, John, and Michael loved the underground home. It had one large room with a dirt floor. Growing up from it were large mushrooms that the boys used as stools. A fireplace warmed the room. One bed stood against the back wall. At 6:30 every night, Wendy pulled the bed down. It almost filled the room. All of the boys would hop onto the bed. Wendy would tell stories until they fell asleep. Tinker Bell had finally come home. She was very sorry for what she had tried to do to Wendy. Wendy understood and forgave her. One night, Wendy settled down to tell a story. I'm going to get over here so you can see Tinker Bell. One night, Wendy settled down to tell a story. Michael, John, and the lost boys were in bed. Peter sat on a mushroom stool with Tinker Bell on his shoulder. As Wendy prepared to tell her story, pirates crept through the woods above. They wanted to catch the Indians. Slowly they circled the Indian village and waited for a sign to attack. "There once was a gentleman and a lady," Wendy began. "Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Darling. They had 3 children, John, Michael, and Wendy. They had a dog named Nana. One night Peter Pan flew into their house. He taught the children how to fly, and he told them about the lost boys in Neverland." The boys in the bed smiled. The children wanted to meet the lost boys, so Peter, Tink, and the children flew away to Neverland. Now came the part Peter hated. "The children knew their mother and father would always keep the window open for them to fly back," continued Wendy. "And so the children stayed in Neverland for many years and had a happy time." Peter could stand no more of the story. He jumped up and stamped his feet. "A lot you know about mothers," he said. "I thought my mother would always keep the window open for me too, but when I tried to go home, I found the window was closed and locked. There was another boy sleeping in my bed. I couldn't go home again. Not ever." Wendy, John, and Michael grew afraid. "We must go home at once," Wendy said. "Peter, will you make the arrangements?" Peter was surprised and angry. He didn't know his words would make the children leave. He didn't want Wendy to go home. "No, I won't," he said coldly. Wendy looked hurt. Peter felt sorry for her. Tinker Bell can take you across the sea if you really want to do it, he said slowly. Wendy looked at the lost boys. They were sad to be losing their only mother. If you will all come to our home, I'm sure my father and mother will let you live with us, she said. The lost boys jumped for joy. Peter, can we go? All right, Peter said with a bitter voice, but I will not go with you. I'm going to stay in Neverland. I never want to grow up. I'm going to stay a boy and have fun. Wendy and the boys begged Peter to go with them, but he refused. It's all right, Wendy said at last. Peter knows the way to the window. He can come whenever he wishes to see us again. Tinker Bell and the children gathered their things for the trip. One by one, they said goodbye to Peter. They each made their way up through the hole to the ground above their home. All of a sudden, loud shouts and cries filled the air. The children rushed back underground. Peter, what is it? Wendy asked. The noise had frightened them. The pirates have attacked the Indians, Peter said. Everyone stay quiet and listen. If the Indians have won, they'll beat the tom-tom. That's always their victory signal. Above ground, the pirates' attack took the Indians by surprise. Most of the tribe was captured. Princess Tiger Lily and a few Indian braves escaped through the dark woods. Smee searched the chief's teepee until he found the tom-tom. Captain Hook was delighted. He and Smee crept quietly through the forest to the mushroom chimney. Smee beat the tom-tom twice, then stopped to listen. They both pressed their ears close to the chimney. Down below, the boys heard the sound of the drum. The Indians have won, Peter shouted. The children cheered. It would now be safe to leave for home. Hook signaled to his men. The pirates quickly surrounded the 7 trees where Wendy and the boys would come up out of their underground home. Think of it, Smee, whispered Hook. We'll get them all, and we didn't have to give them a cake. The first to come out of a tree was Curly. He poked his head out of the tree hole and looked around. All of a sudden, a huge pirate clamped his hand over Curly's mouth. A second pirate picked him up and threw him to another, who tossed him to another until Curly landed on the ground at Hook's feet. Nibs was captured next, then Slightly, then Toodles, and then the twins. John was the first of the Darling children to come above ground. He, too, was captured and waited helplessly for Michael to join him. Wendy was the last to be captured. Hook took off his hat and bowed to her. She tried to scream and warn Peter, but Smee clamped his hand tightly over her mouth. Just then, the music from Peter's pipe started to come up through the hole in the tree. You see, my dear, Hook sneered. Peter has forgotten you already. Wendy tried to bite Smee's hand, but he was too strong for her. Hook laughed and ordered his men to take the captives to his pirate ship. Then Hook rushed to the mushroom chimney and looked inside. Below ground, Peter played on his pipes. He tried to make believe that he did not care about Wendy and the boys, but he felt so sad and lonely that his head began to hurt. Peter took a bottle of medicine from a shelf. He poured a bit of it into a glass, but he hated to take medicine, so he put it down. At last, he lay down on the bed and forced himself to sleep. When Hook was sure Peter was asleep, he lowered himself through a hole into the underground house. Silently, he tiptoed to the sleeping Peter Pan. Then he caught sight of the medicine glass and reached into the pocket of his coat for a small vial of black liquid. Hook pulled out the cork and poured 5 drops from the vial into Peter's glass. Plink, 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 plink. He took one long, gloating look at Peter, then slinked back up the tree. Peter slept for a long time. Just as he was starting to awaken, he heard a small tinkle of bells. Hi, Tink, he said lazily. You finally have what you always wanted, Tink. You and I are alone in Neverland. Tink began to fly wildly around the room. Peter watched and listened carefully as Tinker Bell told him about the capture of Wendy and the boys. Peter sprang to his feet, grabbing his weapons. He dashed toward the hole that would lead him above ground, but the medicine glass caught Peter's eyes. Just a minute, Tink. I better drink this first. No! Tink rang her bells loudly. She'd overheard Hook talking about his deed. Something's wrong, she said. Don't be silly, Tink. What could be wrong? He raised the glass to his lips. Tink panicked. With lightning speed, she flew between Peter's lips. When he tipped the glass, Tink drank the medicine before it could reach Peter's mouth. A few moments later, her body began to shake. With Peter's help, she flew to the bed and lay down. "It was poison, Peter." Her voice was growing weak. Peter knelt beside her. "Oh, Tink," he cried. "Think beautiful thoughts and the thoughts will help you." But Tinkerbell's light was growing dimmer. Peter tried shaking her, but it didn't help. He was afraid if Tinkerbell's light went out, she would die. He searched all over the house, but he couldn't find anything that would help Tink. Suddenly he had an idea. Peter stood up as tall as he could reach, his arms spread out wide. "Boys and girls of the world," he called. "Everyone who has ever dreamed of Neverland, please help Tinkerbell live. If you believe in Tinkerbell," he shouted, "clap your hands. Don't let Tink die." Peter waited. Then he heard a loud sound. It was far away, but soon it came closer and closer. At last, Neverland was filled with a thunderous clapping of millions of children all over the world. It worked. Tink's light grew brighter. Her voice grew strong. All at once, she leaped from the bed and flitted around the room. Fairy dust sparkled in the air. Peter shouted his thanks to all the children who had helped Tinkerbell, and now he vowed, raising his sword, to save the others. Peter pressed through the dark, silent forest toward the bay. "It's Hook or me this time, I swear," he shouted. "Who's gonna be?"